My name is Elena Vasquez, 32 years old, and for the past decade I have been the family disappointment who chose teaching over law school. When my grandmother passed away and the family gathered for the reading of her will, I watched my cousins receive jewelry, cash, and antiques while the lawyer handed me a simple wooden box no bigger than a shoebox. My sister Vanessa actually laughed out loud and said, "Looks like Grandma knew exactly what you were worth." What she did not know was that inside that box was the deed to the lakefront property our entire family had been fighting over for 20 years. The house worth over $2 million that Grandma had promised to whoever truly understood her values. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you have ever been underestimated by your own family, or watched someone judge your worth based on their shallow standards, leave a comment below. Do not forget to subscribe to hear how I made sure my family learned the most important lesson my grandmother ever taught: that value is not measured in dollar signs or prestigious careers, but in character, compassion, and the quiet ways we show up for the people who need us most. The relationship I shared with my grandmother, Rosa Delgado, was unlike anything else in my life. While the rest of the family saw her as the keeper of a real estate fortune built over 50 years of savvy investments, I knew her as the woman who taught me to garden, who stayed up late helping me prepare lessons for my struggling students, and who never once made me feel inadequate for choosing a path that served others rather than enriched myself. Grandma Rosa had immigrated from Colombia at 19 years old with nothing but determination, and a gift for seeing potential where others saw only problems. She had transformed rundown properties into thriving homes, built a portfolio that made her wealthy by anyone's standards, and yet she lived simply in the same modest house she had purchased in 1975. Every Sunday for the past 10 years, I had driven the 40 minutes from my small apartment in the city to her home in Riverside Meadows, a quiet neighborhood where she had lived since before I was born. We would spend the afternoon in her garden, tending to the tomatoes and herbs she cultivated with the same patient attention she applied to everything in her life. She would ask about my students, remembering names and struggles I had mentioned weeks earlier, and she would share stories about her own journey that always seemed to contain some wisdom I needed at exactly that moment. When my engagement to Michael collapsed 3 years ago after he pressured me to quit teaching and join his father's investment firm, Grandma Rosa had held me while I cried, and then said something I would never forget. "Elena, a man who wants to change who you are does not love you. He loves an idea of who he wishes you were. The right person will see your calling as sacred, not as something to overcome." My relationship with the rest of my family had always been more complicated. My mother, Patricia, had married into the Delgado family and spent 30 years trying to position herself and her children as the primary heirs to Grandma Rosa's fortune. She had pushed my older sister Vanessa into corporate law, celebrated when Vanessa made partner at 29, and displayed Vanessa's accomplishments like trophies that proved our family's worth. My younger brother Marco had followed a similar path into investment banking, working 80-hour weeks and earning a salary that allowed him to buy a downtown condo before he turned 27. Then there was me, the middle child who had derailed the family's upward trajectory by choosing elementary education, earning a modest salary, and finding fulfillment in work that would never make me wealthy or impressive at cocktail parties. My mother had spent years trying to change my mind, suggesting I could always go back to school for an MBA, hinting that teaching was a fine hobby but not a real career, and introducing me to eligible men who worked in finance or law or medicine, anyone whose credentials might compensate for my own lack of ambition. The extended family had absorbed this narrative until it became accepted truth. At family gatherings, conversations would turn to Vanessa's latest case or Marco's recent promotion, while my contributions to the discussion about struggling students or creative lesson plans would be met with polite smiles that barely masked indifference or pity. My cousin Adrian, who ran a successful tech startup, had once told me at Thanksgiving that it was admirable that I was satisfied with so little, as though contentment in meaningful work was a character flaw rather than a conscious choice. Grandma Rosa had been the only family member who consistently validated my path. She had funded my teaching certification program when I could not afford it myself. She had attended every school event where my students performed or presented their work, and she had listened with genuine interest when I shared the small victories that made my work worthwhile. When Grandma Rosa suffered a stroke 6 months ago, I had rearranged my schedule to visit her every day in the hospital and then in the rehabilitation facility. I read to her when she could not focus on television, helped her with physical therapy exercises, and sat quietly beside her bed when she was too tired for conversation but did not want to be alone. Vanessa had visited twice in 3 months, both times for less than an hour, and Marco had managed 3 brief visits between business trips. The rest of the extended family had sent flowers and cards but rarely appeared in person. During those months of recovery, Grandma Rosa had grown increasingly reflective about her life and what she wanted her legacy to be. She spoke often about the difference between building wealth and building a life of meaning, about the properties she had renovated and the families who had made homes in them, about the immigrant community she had supported quietly over the decades by providing affordable housing when other landlords were exploiting vulnerable tenants. She had started asking me questions about my students, wanting to know their specific challenges and dreams, and she had begun making phone calls to her lawyer that she did not discuss with anyone. At the time, I had assumed she was simply organizing her affairs in the way any practical person does when confronting their mortality. I had no idea she was orchestrating one final lesson for a family that had lost sight of what actually mattered. Grandma Rosa passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in early September, just as the school year was beginning. I had visited the evening before and found her tired but peaceful, sitting in her favorite chair overlooking the garden we had planted together. She had taken my hand and told me she was proud of the woman I had become, that I reminded her of herself at my age when she had been determined to build something meaningful, rather than simply accumulate wealth. She had smiled and said something that seemed strange at the time but would make perfect sense later. She told me that the most valuable things in life often come in humble packages, and that people who judge by appearances almost always miss what truly matters. I had kissed her forehead and promised to return the next evening to help her with the crossword puzzle she completed every day. But by noon the following day she was gone. The family's response to her death revealed everything about the priorities that had come to define us. Within hours of receiving the news, conversations had already turned to speculation about the will and what each person might inherit. My mother had immediately begun calling extended family members to remind them of how much care she had provided over the years, conveniently forgetting that the bulk of that care had come from professional nurses and from me. Vanessa had started researching the current market value of Grandma Rosa's properties, creating spreadsheets that calculated potential inheritance scenarios based on various distribution models. Marco had contacted an estate lawyer to understand tax implications and investment strategies for inherited real estate. Meanwhile, I had gone to Grandma Rosa's house and sat in her garden crying, grieving the loss of the one person who had consistently made me feel seen and valued for exactly who I was. The funeral service had been beautiful and well attended, reflecting the genuine impact Grandma Rosa had made in her community over 5 decades. Former tenants spoke about how she had worked with them during financial hardships. Community leaders thanked her for quiet philanthropy that had supported immigrant families and educational programs, and former business partners praised her integrity in an industry not known for such qualities. Yet during the reception afterward, I had overheard my cousin Adrian joking with Marco about how all this sentimentality was fine but everyone was really there waiting to hear about the will. Vanessa had been more subtle but equally calculating, networking with Grandma Rosa's lawyer and financial advisor as though she were working a business conference rather than mourning our grandmother. The will reading had been scheduled for the following week at the offices of Morrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled Grandma Rosa's affairs for 30 years. Robert Morrison himself, now in his 70s and semi-retired, had specifically requested to handle this reading personally out of respect for his longtime client. The family had gathered in a large conference room with windows overlooking the city, everyone dressed in dark colors that suggested mourning but with an undercurrent of anticipation that felt inappropriate given we had buried Grandma Rosa only days earlier. My mother had positioned herself in a prominent seat at the table, flanked by Vanessa and Marco as though they were a unified front. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Carolina, along with their children Adrian and Sophia, occupied the other side. Various cousins filled out the remaining seats, and I had taken a spot near the back corner, feeling as I always did at family gatherings like someone who existed on the periphery of the real action. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Robert Morrison had entered carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that I could not quite read. something between professional solemnity and what almost looked like suppressed amusement. He had begun by offering condolences and acknowledging Rosa Delgado as one of the finest people he had known in 40 years of legal practice, a statement that prompted impatient nodding from family members who clearly wanted him to proceed to the distribution of assets. Morrison had then explained that Grandma Rosa had been very specific in her instructions, that she had updated her will multiple times in recent months, and that he was obligated to carry out her wishes exactly as written regardless of anyone's personal feelings about those wishes. This preamble had created a stir of unease in the room, with family members exchanging glances that suggested concern about what unexpected complications might arise. The reading had begun with small bequests to longtime employees and charitable organizations, donations that prompted approving nods but no real interest since they did not affect family inheritance. Then Morrison had moved into the distribution of personal items and smaller properties. Vanessa had received Grandma Rosa's jewelry collection, pieces of significant monetary and sentimental value, that included her engagement ring and several items inherited from her own mother in Colombia. Vanessa had actually clapped her hands together in satisfaction before catching herself and assuming a more appropriate expression of grateful solemnity. Marco had received a rental property portfolio consisting of 4 apartment buildings in appreciating neighborhoods, assets worth at least $800,000 that would generate substantial ongoing income. He had fist-pumped under the table, a gesture I caught only because I was seated at an angle that let me see his lap. Uncle Thomas had received commercial properties including the strip mall on Henderson Avenue that housed a grocery store and several thriving small businesses. Aunt Carolina had received stocks and bonds totaling over $400,000. Adrian and Sophia had each received sizable cash bequests of $100,000 each. Various cousins received smaller amounts of cash, personal items of sentimental value, or investment accounts that Rosa had established years earlier. Each announcement had brought expressions of satisfaction, gratitude, or in some cases barely concealed disappointment when the bequest was smaller than anticipated. My mother had grown increasingly tense as the reading continued without my name being mentioned, clearly worried that I might receive something substantial that would validate my life choices in a way she had spent years denying. Then Morrison had looked directly at me and said my name with particular emphasis, as though he wanted everyone's full attention on what came next. Elena Maria Vasquez, he had read from the document, I leave my most treasured possession, knowing she will understand its true value and honor the principles it represents. Morrison had then produced a wooden box from beneath the table, something about 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and perhaps 6 inches deep. The wood was dark mahogany, beautifully finished but simple in design with no ornamentation beyond clean lines and careful craftsmanship. It was the kind of box you might store letters or photographs in, personal but not obviously valuable. Morrison had placed it on the table in front of me and explained that per Rosa's instructions, I was to receive this box and its contents with her love and confidence that I would know what to do with what I found inside. The room had gone completely silent for approximately 3 seconds before someone snorted with laughter. I looked up to see Vanessa covering her mouth but unable to hide the amusement in her eyes. Marco had let out a sound that was half laugh and half disbelief. My mother's face had flushed red, and I could not tell whether she was embarrassed on my behalf or furious that Grandma Rosa had essentially excluded me from any meaningful inheritance. Adrian had leaned over to whisper something to Sophia that made her giggle, and various cousins had exchanged looks that ranged from pity to schadenfreude. Vanessa had been the first to actually speak, her voice dripping with the kind of false sympathy that makes actual sympathy seem cruel by comparison. She had looked at me with wide eyes and said in a tone someone might use with a disappointed child, "Oh, Elena, that's so sweet. Grandma gave you a memory box. How thoughtful." The implication was clear in her emphasis on memory box versus the tangible assets everyone else had received. She had continued before I could respond, turning to address the room, as though she were graciously interpreting the situation for everyone present. Grandma must have wanted Elena to have something sentimental since she spent so much time together. It is probably full of photographs or letters, things that matter more when you do not really need the money. That final phrase had hung in the air like poison, suggesting that my modest teacher's salary made me the perfect recipient for worthless sentimental items, while those with real careers and financial responsibilities deserved actual assets. Marco had laughed outright then, not even attempting to disguise it as a cough or cover it with his hand. He had gestured at the box and said to Vanessa loud enough for everyone to hear. Well, at least someone got what they deserved. Perfect gift for someone satisfied with so little. My mother had closed her eyes as though in pain, whether from the insult to her daughter or from the implication that I was the family failure I could not determine. Uncle Thomas, who had always been slightly kinder than the others, had at least attempted to redirect the conversation by suggesting we should all be grateful for what we received and honor Rose's memory rather than making comparisons. But even his intervention felt patronizing, as though he were encouraging children to be gracious about unequal birthday presents. Aunt Carolina had reached over and patted my hand in what she probably thought was a comforting gesture, while saying that sentimental value was priceless, and perhaps that was exactly what I needed, rather than the burden of managing real estate or investments. The message beneath her words was clear as crystal. I was too incompetent to handle actual assets, so Grandma Rosa had wisely given me something that could not lose value because it had none to begin with. Robert Morrison had maintained professional neutrality throughout these exchanges, but I caught something in his eyes when he looked at me, something that looked almost like anticipation or perhaps solidarity. He had cleared his throat and reminded everyone that Rose's instructions had been explicit, that each bequest had been made with considerable thought and purpose, and that perhaps judgment should be withheld until people fully understood what they had received. This statement had created a momentary pause in the mockery, but Vanessa had recovered quickly and suggested with a smile that felt like a knife that we all understood perfectly well what everyone had received. Some of us had received futures while others had received the past. I had sat there holding the wooden box and feeling the weight of 3 decades of family dynamics crushing down on me. This was not new. I had been the disappointment, the one who chose wrong, the one who would never measure up according to the metrics my family valued. But something about receiving what appeared to be essentially nothing, while watching my siblings receive hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets crystallized every moment of dismissal and diminishment I had experienced. I could feel tears threatening but refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Instead, I had simply thanked Morrison for executing Grandma Rosa's wishes, told him I would be in touch if I had questions, and stood to leave while clutching the box against my chest like armor. As I walked toward the conference room door, I heard Vanessa stage whisper to Marco, "I guess we know who the real grandchildren were." The words had struck me with physical force, suggesting that my relationship with Grandma Rosa, the hundreds of hours I had spent with her, the genuine love and connection we had shared, all of it meant nothing compared to genetic proximity combined with career success. I had paused with my hand on the door handle, tempted to turn around and defend myself or explain, or make them understand that they had missed everything important about who Grandma Rosa was and what she valued. But what would have been the point? These were people who measured worth in asset values and saw compassion as weakness. Nothing I could say would penetrate the fortress of their self-satisfaction. I had left the law office, walked to my aging Honda Civic in the parking garage, and sat behind the wheel still holding the box. The tears came then, not from sadness exactly but from a complicated mixture of grief for Grandma Rosa, rage at my family's cruelty, and exhaustion from years of being made to feel inadequate for choosing a life of meaning over a life of accumulation. I cried for perhaps 10 minutes, letting out everything I had held in during the reading, and during the months of watching Grandma Rosa decline while my siblings counted their anticipated inheritance. Finally, when the tears had subsided into occasional hiccups, I looked down at the box in my lap. The wood was smooth under my fingers, clearly crafted with skill and care. Whatever else was true, this box itself was beautiful, and it had belonged to someone I loved who had loved me in return. I carefully opened the brass clasp and lifted the lid, not knowing what to expect but assuming Vanessa's guess about photographs or letters was probably correct. Instead, what I found made my breath catch in my throat and my hands begin to shake. Resting on top of several documents was a handwritten letter in Grandma Rosa's distinctive script, the slightly slanted writing I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on my car windshield after her Sunday visits. Beneath the letter were legal documents, property deeds, keys, and what looked like architectural plans. But it was the letter I reached for first, unfolding the pale blue stationery with fingers that trembled as I began to read words that would change everything I thought I understood about the reading I had just endured. The letter began with the words, "My dearest Elena," in Grandma Rosa's careful handwriting, and I could almost hear her voice speaking the words as I read them in the dim light of the parking garage. She wrote that if I was reading this letter, she had passed on and the family had gathered for the reading of her will. She imagined that I had just endured mockery or pity from relatives who believed she had given me nothing of value while blessing them with tangible assets. She wanted me to know that everything had unfolded exactly as she had planned, and that what I held in my hands represented not an afterthought or a sentimental consolation prize, but rather the culmination of her life's work and the future she had envisioned for someone who shared her deepest values. Grandma Rosa explained that the box contained the deed to the lakefront property on Clearwater Lake, the crown jewel of her real estate portfolio, and the one asset that every member of the family had coveted for decades. The property consisted of 5 acres of pristine waterfront land, a beautifully maintained 4-bedroom main house built in 1962 and renovated extensively over the years, a guest cottage, a boathouse, and gardens that she had cultivated for nearly 40 years. The property had been appraised most recently at $2.3 million, though its value extended far beyond any monetary figure. This was the place where our family had gathered for summer weekends throughout my childhood, where Grandma Rosa had hosted community events and fundraisers, where she had found peace and purpose in equal measure. This was the property that Uncle Thomas had been lobbying to inherit so he could convert it into a commercial wedding venue, that Vanessa had wanted to sell immediately to fund her partnership buy-in at the law firm, that Marco had planned to develop into luxury condominiums to maximize return on investment. I read the words 3 times to make certain I understood them correctly. The deed to Clearwater Lake was in this box. The property that represented everything my family valued about Grandma Rosa's success, the tangible symbol of wealth and status they had spent years positioning themselves to inherit, had been given to me. The family member they had just mocked for receiving nothing, the one they considered too simple and unworldly to handle real assets, now owned the single most valuable piece of Grandma Rosa's estate. The irony was so profound that I started laughing through my tears, a sound that probably appeared unhinged to anyone who might have been passing through the parking garage at that moment. But Grandma Rosa's letter continued with explanations that transformed my laughter back into tears of a different kind. She wrote that she had chosen me not despite my modest career and simple life, but precisely because of those choices. She explained that over the past 5 years, she had watched each member of the family reveal their true priorities through their treatment of the Clearwater property. Uncle Thomas had stopped visiting once she made clear she would not discuss its future while she was alive, demonstrating that his interest was in the asset rather than in spending time with her. Vanessa had brought real estate agents to family gatherings under the pretense of introducing friends, trying to get informal valuations that would help her plan for its eventual sale. Marco had repeatedly suggested that she was getting too old to maintain such a large property, and should consider moving somewhere more manageable. Transparent code for wanting her to liquidate so he could inherit cash rather than real estate. Meanwhile, I had simply continued showing up every Sunday regardless of whether we were at her modest primary residence or spending the afternoon at the lake house. I had helped her weed the gardens without being asked, had repaired the dock railing when I noticed it was loose, had brought my students to the property for an end-of-year celebration because I knew Grandma Rosa loved seeing the place filled with children's laughter. I had never once asked about her plans for the property or suggested she should do anything differently. I had valued the place for what it was rather than what it might become, and that distinction had meant everything to her. Grandma Rosa wrote that the property was not simply a gift, but also a responsibility and a test of character. She had established a trust fund that would cover property taxes and basic maintenance for the next 5 years, giving me time to determine how I wanted to steward the land without immediate financial pressure. However, she had also included specific instructions about what she hoped I would do with the place. She wanted the property to become a retreat center for teachers, a place where educators could spend weekends or summer weeks, rejuvenating away from the demands of their profession. She envisioned writing workshops and art classes, garden therapy and quiet contemplation, a space that honored the sacred work of teaching by providing teachers with the restoration they rarely received from a society that undervalued their contributions. She had included architectural plans for converting the guest cottage into additional sleeping quarters that could accommodate up to 12 teachers at a time. She had outlined a budget for necessary renovations drawn from a separate account she had established for exactly this purpose. She had even contacted several educational nonprofit organizations that had expressed interest in partnering to subsidize costs for teachers who could not afford retreat fees. Everything had been researched and planned with the same meticulous attention she had applied to every business venture throughout her life. The difference was that this venture measured success not in profit margins, but in lives touched and spirits restored. The letter concluded with words that I would carry with me through everything that followed. Grandma Rosa wrote that she had spent 50 years building wealth, but that she measured her life's success by whether she had built anything that outlasted her bank accounts and property deeds. She hoped that I would take the beautiful place she had loved and transform it into something that served others, that I would prove to our family that the most valuable inheritance was not cash or assets, but rather a commitment to making the world gentler and more supportive for those who dedicated their lives to helping others. She wrote that she was proud of me, that she had always been proud of me, and that she knew I would honor her memory by using this gift in ways that multiplied its value through compassion rather than calculation. I sat in my car holding that letter and understanding for the first time the full scope of what Grandma Rosa had orchestrated. This was not just about giving me a valuable property. This was about exposing the family's values by letting them reveal themselves through their assumptions and reactions. She had known exactly how they would respond to seeing me receive what appeared to be nothing. She had predicted their mockery and their dismissiveness because she had witnessed those same attitudes expressed in subtler ways for years. And she had constructed a situation where their true characters would be on full display at the precise moment when I discovered that I had inherited what they all wanted most. The vindication was almost secondary to the profound validation of knowing that someone had truly seen me, had understood the challenges I faced within our family dynamic, and had crafted a response that affirmed my choices while exposing the emptiness of theirs. But before I could fully process the implications of what I had inherited, I needed to understand how I had arrived at this moment. The truth was that my relationship with my family had been deteriorating slowly over many years, eroded by 1,000 small dismissals and the steady pressure to become someone I was not. Understanding that history was essential to appreciating why Grandma Rosa's gift meant so much more than its monetary value, why the family's mockery had stung so deeply, and why the reversal that was coming would represent not just poetic justice but a fundamental reckoning with the values that had divided us. I had always been different from Vanessa and Marco, even as a child. Where they were competitive and status-conscious even in elementary school, I had been the kid who brought home injured birds and organized fundraisers for the local animal shelter. Where they had obsessed over grades as measures of their worth and potential earning capacity, I had loved learning for its own sake and felt devastated when I saw classmates struggling without support. My parents had initially found my empathy endearing in the way adults find children's innocence charming, something they assumed I would outgrow as I matured and understood how the real world operated. But I had not outgrown it. If anything, my commitment to service and education had deepened as I moved through high school and into college. I had tutored struggling students throughout my teenage years, often for free when families could not afford to pay. I had volunteered at community centers teaching art classes to children whose schools had eliminated arts programs due to budget cuts. I had chosen to major in elementary education despite my mother's visible disappointment and her suggestions that I should consider something more practical like business administration or pre-law. She had actually cried when I told her my intended major, not from pride but from what she perceived as lost potential, as though dedicating my life to teaching children was a waste of my intelligence rather than an application of it. The tension had escalated during my junior year of college, when I had turned down a lucrative internship at a consulting firm that recruited on campus. The position would have paid more than most entry-level teaching jobs, and could have led to a career trajectory that my parents would have celebrated. But I had already committed to spending that summer working at an educational nonprofit that served underprivileged communities, earning barely enough to cover my rent, but gaining experience that confirmed my calling. My mother had been furious, accusing me of self-sabotage and suggesting that I was deliberately choosing poverty to spite her or to prove some naive point about the nobility of struggling. She could not conceive that I genuinely found more fulfillment in meaningful work than in maximizing my earning potential. Vanessa had been finishing law school at that time, already positioning herself for prestigious clerkships and firm positions. She had taken me aside at a family dinner and delivered what she clearly believed was wise sisterly advice. She had explained that idealism was fine as a hobby but foolish as a career strategy, that I needed to think about my future and my security rather than chasing some romantic notion of making a difference. She had actually used the phrase, "When you grow up and face reality," as though my choices reflected immaturity, rather than a different value system. The condescension had been difficult to endure, made worse by the fact that she genuinely believed she was helping me by steering me toward a path that looked more like hers. Marco had been less diplomatic in his assessment. He had simply told me that I was making a mistake I would regret when I was 40 years old and struggling financially while he and Vanessa were secure and comfortable. He had framed it as a mathematical certainty rather than a difference in priorities, as though human fulfillment could be calculated purely in terms of retirement account balances and real estate equity. What he could not understand, what none of them could understand, was that I had already calculated differently. I had determined that a life spent helping children develop confidence and curiosity was worth more to me than any salary or status symbol, and that struggling financially in service of that mission was preferable to being comfortable while doing work that felt empty. Grandma Rosa had been the singular exception to the family's collective disappointment in my choices. When I had graduated with my teaching degree, she had been the one person who had seemed genuinely proud rather than resigned or sympathetic. She had taken me to dinner at her favorite Colombian restaurant and told me stories about her own mother, who had been a teacher in Bogotá before the family's circumstances had forced her into factory work after immigrating. Grandma Rosa had explained that her mother had considered teaching the most honorable profession, that she had mourned giving it up more than she had mourned leaving behind their home or their extended family. Watching me choose education voluntarily, with full awareness of the financial sacrifices involved, had reminded Grandma Rosa of her mother's dedication and values. She had told me that evening that I was honoring generations of women who had understood that shaping young minds was sacred work, and that she would support my path regardless of what anyone else in the family thought. That support had been consistent and unwavering throughout the following decade. When I had struggled during my first year of teaching, overwhelmed by the gap between idealistic preparation and classroom reality, Grandma Rosa had listened to my doubts without dismissing them, but also without suggesting I should quit. She had shared stories about her own early years in real estate when she had made mistakes and questioned whether she could succeed in an industry dominated by men who did not take her seriously. She had explained that meaningful work was almost always difficult, that the challenge was part of what made it meaningful, and that perseverance through struggle built the kind of character that easy success never could. When my engagement to Michael had collapsed, Grandma Rosa had been equally supportive in helping me recognize that the failure was not mine but rather a fundamental incompatibility in values. Michael had been handsome and successful and charming at parties, everything my mother had wanted for me. He had worked at his father's investment firm and earned enough to support us comfortably even if I quit teaching entirely, which had been his preference. At first, he had framed it as concern for my well-being, suggesting that I was exhausting myself for insufficient compensation, and that I deserved to enjoy life rather than work so hard for people who did not appreciate my efforts. But gradually his true feelings had emerged. He found my commitment to teaching embarrassing in social situations where his colleagues and clients asked what I did for a living. He wanted a wife whose career complemented his own in terms of status and networking potential, not someone whose profession prompted sympathetic comments about noble sacrifice and dedication. The breaking point had come when Michael had surprised me with an application packet for an MBA program, already filled out with my information and requiring only my signature. He had presented it as a romantic gesture, something he had done to help me see a better path forward. When I had explained that I did not want an MBA and had no intention of leaving teaching, he had become frustrated and then angry. He had accused me of being stubborn and short-sighted, of valuing my pride more than our future together, of forcing him to choose between his embarrassment about my career and his feelings for me. I had realized in that moment that he had never actually loved me, but rather had loved the version of me he believed he could create once I stopped being foolish about teaching and became someone more suitable for his life. Grandma Rosa had validated my decision to end the engagement even as my mother had pleaded with me to reconsider and Vanessa had suggested I was throwing away a good man over something that did not really matter. Grandma Rosa had been the one who had pointed out that if my career did not really matter, then Michael should have had no trouble accepting it, and that his insistence that I change suggested it mattered a great deal to him in ways that were incompatible with genuine love. She had helped me move out of the apartment Michael and I had shared, had listened to me cry through the grief of losing not just a partner but also the fantasy of being accepted by my family through marriage to someone they approved of, and had gradually helped me see that the end of that relationship was a gift rather than a loss. In the years that followed, Grandma Rosa had made a point of attending school events where my students presented their work or performed in programs I had directed. She had been there for curriculum nights and parent-teacher conferences, as though she were the grandmother of every child in my classroom. She had donated supplies when my budget ran out mid-year, had funded field trips that the school could not afford, and had quietly established a scholarship fund for students from my classes who showed academic promise but lacked financial resources for college. She had seen my work not as something to be tolerated or pitied, but as something to be celebrated and supported, and that recognition had sustained me through years when my own parents could barely bring themselves to ask about my teaching except in the most perfunctory ways. Our Sunday visits had become sacred time for both of us, though I had not fully realized how much they had meant to her until reading her letter. We would work in her garden together, her movements slower than they had once been but her knowledge still encyclopedic as she taught me about companion planting and soil health and the patience required to grow anything worth harvesting. We would cook together, traditional Colombian dishes she had learned from her mother supplemented by recipes she had discovered during 50 years of making homes in kitchens across different properties. And we would talk about everything and nothing, about my students and her memories, about current events and family dynamics, about what it meant to build a life that mattered rather than a life that merely looked impressive from the outside. During those conversations, I had learned things about Grandma Rosa's life that the rest of the family either did not know or had never bothered to ask about. I learned that she had arrived in the United States pregnant and unmarried, a scandal that had resulted in her family disowning her and leaving her completely alone in a country where she barely spoke the language. I learned that my grandfather, who had died before I was born, had been a good man but not a wealthy one, that they had built their real estate business together from nothing through decades of sacrifice and strategic risk-taking. I learned that she had faced discrimination and harassment as a Latina woman trying to establish herself in an industry dominated by white men who assumed she was someone's secretary, rather than a legitimate investor. I learned that her determination to provide affordable housing for immigrant families had come from her own experience of being exploited by landlords who charged premium prices for substandard conditions, because they knew undocumented families had no recourse. I learned that several times she had been offered opportunities to maximize profit by raising rents beyond what her tenants could afford or by selling to developers who would displace long-term residents, and that each time she had refused because she remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable and powerless. Her wealth had been built steadily over decades through ethical practices that prioritized sustainability over exploitation, and she had taken pride in knowing that families had built stable lives in homes she had provided at fair rates. These stories had shaped my understanding of what success could mean when it was defined by integrity rather than accumulation. Grandma Rosa had proven that it was possible to build wealth without compromising your values, that treating people with dignity and respect was not incompatible with business success, but rather a foundation for sustainable prosperity. She had demonstrated through her life that the most valuable legacy was not the size of your bank account, but rather the positive impact you had made on other people's lives. And she had seen in me someone who understood those principles instinctively, who had chosen a path that prioritized service over profit not because I was naive or impractical, but because I had calculated value differently than most people in our culture were trained to do. When Grandma Rosa had suffered her stroke 6 months before her death, I had rearranged my entire life to be present for her recovery. I had used my accumulated sick days and personal days to visit her daily in the hospital, had advocated for her with medical staff who sometimes spoke about her rather than to her because of her age and accent, and had coordinated with the rehabilitation facility to ensure she received the therapy she needed to regain as much function as possible. During those long days sitting beside her bed, she had been more vulnerable than I had ever seen her, frightened sometimes by her physical limitations and frustrated by her dependence on others. But she had also been reflective in ways that suggested she was consciously preparing for whatever time she had remaining. She had talked often about her mother during those months, about the sacrifices her mother had made and the values she had tried to instill despite the harsh circumstances of their immigrant experience. She had expressed regret that her own daughter, my mother Patricia, had absorbed American materialism so completely that she measured everything in terms of status and comparative wealth rather than contribution or character. She had worried aloud about what would happen to her properties after she died, whether they would continue to serve the communities that depended on them, or whether they would be immediately sold to the highest bidder and converted into investments that displaced families who had lived there for decades. I had assured her that I would do whatever I could to honor her wishes, though at the time I had assumed my influence would be limited given that I was unlikely to inherit any properties myself. I had imagined that I might serve as a voice of conscience within the family, arguing against the most exploitative courses of action, even if I ultimately had no power to prevent them. I had never imagined that she was planning to give me not just a voice but actual authority, that she was constructing a situation where I would have the power to ensure her legacy reflected her values, rather than being dismantled by relatives who saw her life's work only as assets to be liquidated and distributed. Now, sitting in the parking garage with her letter in my hands and the deed to Clearwater Lake resting in the wooden box on my lap, I understood that Grandma Rosa had given me both a tremendous gift and a profound responsibility. She had entrusted me with the place she loved most in the world, and with the vision she had developed for how it could serve others. She had given me the financial resources to make that vision real through the trust fund she had established for maintenance and renovations. And she had given me something equally valuable though harder to quantify. She had given me vindication and validation at a moment when I had felt most diminished by my family's casual cruelty. My relationship with my sister Vanessa had been complicated from the beginning, shaped by the 3-year age gap that positioned her as the trailblazer whose achievements set standards I was expected to meet or exceed. Vanessa had always been the golden child, the one who intuitively understood what our parents valued and delivered it with precision. She had been student council president in high school, had graduated summa cum laude from her undergraduate program, and had secured admission to a top-tier law school with scholarship funding that our parents boasted about to anyone who would listen. She was ambitious in ways that our family celebrated, viewing career advancement and financial success as the primary measures of a life well lived. From early childhood, Vanessa had demonstrated a competitive streak that extended beyond healthy sibling rivalry into something more calculated and occasionally cruel. When I was 7 and she was 10, I had won a school art competition that resulted in my drawing being displayed in the district office building. I had been thrilled by the recognition, proud that something I had created would be seen by so many people. Vanessa had congratulated me with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, then had accidentally spilled an entire glass of grape juice across my winning artwork the following day, ruining it beyond repair. She had apologized profusely, and our parents had accepted it as an unfortunate accident despite my tearful insistence that she had done it deliberately. The pattern had been established early. Vanessa would undermine my achievements while maintaining plausible deniability, and authority figures would give her the benefit of the doubt while suggesting I was being oversensitive or seeking attention. In high school, the dynamic had intensified as our diverging interests became more apparent. I had joined the theater program and discovered a passion for helping younger students develop confidence through performance. I had directed a production of children's fairy tales performed by elementary students as a community service project, investing months of after-school time into something that brought me tremendous satisfaction, but no tangible credentials for college applications. Vanessa had dismissed the entire endeavor as a waste of time that could have been spent on activities that actually mattered for future success. She had made a point of scheduling a college visit during the weekend of our final performance, ensuring that our parents would miss my show to accompany her on what she insisted was a time-sensitive opportunity to tour a campus. When I had been accepted into the education program at State University, a solid regional school with an excellent reputation for teacher preparation, Vanessa had managed to frame even this achievement as evidence of my limited ambitions. She had pointed out that she had been accepted to far more prestigious institutions, conveniently omitting that those schools did not offer education programs, and that I had specifically chosen State University because it aligned with my career goals. She had suggested to our parents that perhaps I had not pushed myself hard enough during high school, that my volunteer work and arts involvement had been pleasant diversions but had not positioned me for admission to elite institutions. The implication had been clear. My choices reflected either inability or unwillingness to compete at her level, and either way represented a disappointment. My younger brother Marco had followed a similar trajectory to Vanessa, though his competitive nature expressed itself differently. Where Vanessa competed through achievement and status markers, Marco competed through material acquisition and lifestyle displays. He had gone into investment banking immediately after completing his business degree, accepting a position that required 80-hour work weeks but offered substantial compensation and rapid advancement potential. Within 3 years, he had purchased a luxury condo in the city's most desirable neighborhood, drove a car that cost more than my annual salary, and wore watches that he would casually mention cost 5 figures. He seemed to measure his success primarily by his ability to afford things that others could not, and he expected family members to be impressed by these displays of wealth. Marco's attitude toward my career had been dismissive from the start, though he occasionally framed his condescension as concern for my financial well-being. He had told me repeatedly that I was wasting my potential, that intelligence like mine should be applied to fields where it would be properly compensated, and that teaching was something people did when they could not succeed in more demanding professions. When I had tried to explain that teaching was itself tremendously demanding, and that I found the work intellectually challenging and emotionally rewarding, he had laughed and said that I was rationalizing a choice I could not afford to reconsider given my student loans and lack of marketable skills for other industries. The cruelty of his assessment had taken my breath away, the suggestion that I was trapped in teaching rather than committed to it, that I had closed doors rather than walked through the one that called to me. But Marco had seemed genuinely confused by my hurt reaction, as though he believed he was simply stating obvious facts that I should have already recognized. In his worldview, career success was measured exclusively by compensation and status, and anything else was self-deception or rationalization. The possibility that someone might genuinely prefer meaningful work over maximum earnings was incomprehensible to him, a sign of immaturity or damaged thinking rather than a legitimate value system. My mother Patricia had been the primary architect of the family value system that prioritized professional prestige and financial success above all other considerations. She had grown up in a working-class family and had married my father Thomas when they were both young and still establishing themselves professionally. My father had built a successful career in pharmaceutical sales, earning a comfortable upper-middle-class income that allowed them to live well and provide opportunities for their children. But my mother had always been acutely conscious of class distinctions and status hierarchies, painfully aware of families who had more wealth or social standing, and determined that her children would achieve the kind of success that would elevate our family's position. She had pushed all 3 of us relentlessly toward achievement, but her vision of achievement was narrowly defined by careers that impressed other people and generated substantial income. Law, medicine, business, and finance were acceptable paths. Teaching, social work, nonprofit management, and the arts were acceptable only as hobbies or temporary diversions before settling into real careers. When I had declared my intention to major in education, my mother had actually asked me if I was trying to punish her for some perceived childhood wrong, as though my career choice was an act of rebellion rather than a calling. She had spent my entire college experience suggesting alternative paths, sending me articles about people who had started in education, but then moved into educational consulting or administration or policy work that paid substantially more than classroom teaching. After I graduated and began my teaching career, her disappointment had settled into a kind of chronic disapproval that colored every family interaction. She would ask about my work in the tone someone might use to inquire about a chronic illness, sympathetic but also slightly impatient that I had not yet recovered and moved on to something better. She would inevitably compare my situation to Vanessa's latest promotion or Marco's most recent bonus, not explicitly but through strategic juxtaposition that made the disparities impossible to ignore. She would offer unsolicited advice about how I might leverage my teaching experience into more lucrative opportunities, refusing to accept that I was not seeking an exit strategy, but rather deepening my commitment to the profession I had chosen. My father Thomas had been less overtly critical but also less supportive than he might have appeared on the surface. He seemed proud of my dedication and would occasionally defend my choices when my mother's criticisms became too pointed. But his defense always contained the implicit concession that I had chosen a difficult path, that I was sacrificing financial security and comfort for idealism, and that while this was admirable in its way, it was also somewhat naive. He never seemed to consider that I might be building security of a different kind, that a life aligned with my values and filled with meaningful work might provide a foundation more stable than any salary or investment portfolio. The family dynamic had extended to the broader Delgado clan, with aunts, uncles, and cousins absorbing and reinforcing the narrative that Vanessa and Marco were the successful siblings while I was the well-meaning but misguided one who had chosen poorly and would eventually regret it. My Uncle Thomas, who had built a successful commercial real estate development company, had been particularly vocal about his assessment of my choices. He had told me at a family gathering when I was 25 that teaching was fine for people who lacked ambition or ability, but that he had expected more from his sister Rose's granddaughter. The comment had been particularly painful because it suggested that I was somehow failing to honor Grandma Rose's legacy of business success, when in fact I believed I was honoring the deeper values that had motivated her business decisions. My Aunt Carolina, Uncle Thomas's wife, had been superficially kinder but perhaps more insidiously undermining. She would express admiration for my dedication while simultaneously suggesting that it was a shame I had to work so hard for so little compensation, as though my financial situation was a tragedy I was enduring rather than a trade-off I had consciously accepted. She would offer hand-me-down clothes and furniture with the explanation that she knew teachers struggled financially and she wanted to help, framing her generosity in ways that emphasized my poverty rather than my choices. Her pity felt more demeaning than Uncle Thomas's direct criticism because it positioned me as an object of charity rather than as an adult who had made intentional decisions about how to structure my life. My cousins Adrian and Sophia had followed trajectories similar to Vanessa and Marco, Adrian into technology entrepreneurship, and Sophia into marketing for a luxury goods company. Both earned substantial incomes and lived lifestyles that they documented extensively on social media, creating curated presentations of success that emphasized travel, dining, and material acquisition. They had been friendly enough to me in person but had developed a habit of tagging me in social media posts about expensive experiences with captions like, "Wish everyone could experience this," or "So grateful for the opportunities my career provides." Messages that felt pointed given they knew I could not afford such luxuries on a teacher's salary. The extended family gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable as the years passed and the disparity between my siblings' financial trajectories and my own became more pronounced. Conversations inevitably turned to career updates, real estate purchases, investment strategies, and vacation plans, topics that positioned me as peripheral to the main action. When people asked about my work, their questions felt obligatory rather than genuinely curious, and their responses to my answers suggested they were simply waiting for an opportunity to redirect the conversation to someone whose accomplishments they found more impressive or relevant. One particularly painful memory involved a family dinner 3 years earlier, when my cousin Adrian had been celebrating the successful sale of his startup to a larger technology company. The acquisition had made him a millionaire before his 30th birthday, and the family had gathered to congratulate him and hear details about the deal. Adrian had been gracious in his success, thanking family members for their support, and acknowledging the risks and luck involved in entrepreneurial ventures. But when my mother had asked him what advice he would give to young family members starting their careers, he had looked directly at me and said that the most important thing was to think strategically about earning potential early on, because it was much harder to course-correct later once you had invested years in a field with limited financial upside. The comment had been ostensibly general career advice, but everyone at the table had understood it as a pointed assessment of my choices. Several family members had glanced at me with expressions ranging from pity to vindication, as though Adrian had finally articulated what they had all been thinking. I had felt my face flush with humiliation and anger, but had said nothing because any response would have been dismissed as defensiveness or inability to accept constructive criticism. Grandma Rosa had been at that dinner, and I had noticed her watching the exchange with an expression I could not quite read, something between sadness and calculation. She had not defended me in the moment, which had hurt, but she had sought me out later as I was leaving and told me that some people measure value only in dollars because they lack the imagination to conceive of any other metric. The pattern had continued and intensified through various life events that highlighted the family's priorities and my divergence from them. When Vanessa had made partner at her law firm at 29, the family had thrown an elaborate celebration at an expensive restaurant, with speeches and toasts that emphasized her achievement and the family's pride in her success. When I had received a teaching award from my district recognizing innovative curriculum development and exceptional student outcomes, my mother had mentioned it briefly at a family dinner, before quickly transitioning to discussing Marco's latest promotion. The message had been unmistakable. Professional recognition only mattered when it came from fields the family respected and admired. My romantic relationships had been subjected to similar scrutiny and judgment. When I had dated men who worked in teaching or nonprofit sectors, My mother had expressed concern that I was limiting myself to partners who could not provide financial security or improve my social standing. When I had briefly dated a doctor my mother had introduced me to, she had been thrilled until he explained that he worked for a community health clinic serving uninsured patients rather than maintaining a private practice, at which point her enthusiasm had visibly dimmed. The engagement to Michael had initially delighted my family precisely because he represented the kind of successful professional they believed I should marry, someone whose career could compensate for my own lack of ambition, and whose family connections could elevate our social position. When that engagement had ended, my mother had been devastated in ways that had nothing to do with my emotional well-being, and everything to do with her disappointment that I had rejected what she viewed as my best opportunity for financial security and social redemption. She had actually suggested that I was being selfish by refusing to compromise on something as trivial as my career, when Michael was offering me a life of comfort and stability. The implication that my professional identity was trivial, something that should be easily sacrificed for material advantages, had crystallized everything problematic about my family's value system. They genuinely could not understand why I would choose authentic partnership, based on shared values over comfortable partnership, based on financial pragmatism. Vanessa had been particularly judgmental about my decision to end the engagement. She had taken me aside at a family gathering shortly after the breakup and delivered what she clearly believed was tough love, but what felt more like cruelty disguised as concern. She had told me that I needed to be realistic about my options, that men like Michael did not come along often for women in my financial situation, and that my insistence on finding someone who celebrated rather than merely tolerated my career was naive romanticism that would leave me alone and struggling. She had actually used the phrase beggars cannot be choosers to describe my romantic prospects, suggesting that my modest income made me undesirable in the relationship marketplace, and that I should be grateful for any successful man willing to overlook my career limitations. The comment had been so cruel and reductive that I had been momentarily speechless. But what had struck me most was that Vanessa had seemed genuinely confused by my hurt and angry response, as though she believed she was simply stating obvious truths that I needed to hear for my own good. She could not conceive that her assessment was not objective reality, but rather a reflection of a value system that measured human worth primarily through earning potential and professional status. The possibility that someone might choose an authentic relationship, based on mutual respect over a comfortable relationship, based on social convenience was completely foreign to her worldview. Marco had contributed his own dismissive perspective on my personal life by repeatedly suggesting that my standards were too high, and that I needed to be more practical about what I could realistically expect given my circumstances. He had even offered to set me up with men he knew through work, always framing these potential introductions in terms of what they earned or what firm they worked for rather than anything about their character or values. When I had declined these offers, he had accused me of being stuck up and unrealistic, suggesting that I was holding out for some fantasy partner who would never materialize because men successful enough to be desirable would not be interested in someone with my limited earning potential. The cumulative effect of years of this treatment had been profound erosion of my sense of belonging within my own family. I had begun to dread family gatherings because I knew they would involve subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that I was the disappointment, the one who had chosen wrong, the cautionary tale about what happened when you prioritized passion over pragmatism. I had developed strategies for deflecting conversations away from my career and toward safer topics, for arriving late and leaving early to minimize exposure to judgment, for positioning myself physically at the periphery of family groups where I could observe without being drawn into uncomfortable exchanges. Grandma Rosa had witnessed all of this over the years, had seen the ways my family diminished and dismissed me, and had increasingly positioned herself as a counterbalance to their judgment. She had made a point of asking detailed questions about my students and my teaching innovations at family gatherings, forcing others to listen as I described work that mattered deeply to me. She had celebrated my teaching award more enthusiastically than she had celebrated Vanessa's partnership, hosting a private dinner for just the two of us where she had presented me with a beautiful leather journal for lesson planning, and told me she was proud of the teacher and person I had become. She had defended my decision to end my engagement when others criticized it, pointing out that a good marriage required shared values, and that financial security without emotional authenticity was just an expensive form of loneliness. But I had not fully understood the extent to which Grandma Rosa had been watching and evaluating everyone's behavior until I read her letter in the parking garage after the will reading. She had been conducting a long-term assessment of her family's character, watching to see who demonstrated genuine love and respect versus who performed family connection, while actually prioritizing personal advantage. She had been noting who showed up consistently versus who appeared only when they wanted something, who listened versus who waited for opportunities to talk about themselves, who celebrated others' successes versus who felt threatened by them. And she had been planning a response that would expose these patterns, while simultaneously rewarding the values she hoped to see perpetuated beyond her lifetime. The family's treatment of me had not existed in isolation, but rather reflected a broader pattern of how they approached relationships and evaluated human worth. They had treated Grandma Rosa herself with similar calculation, visiting more frequently when they wanted to discuss their accomplishments, or when they hoped to influence her estate planning, but finding excuses to be unavailable when she needed help with household tasks or simply wanted company. They had measured the value of time spent with her against the opportunity cost of what else they might accomplish with those hours, a calculus that I had never understood because time with Grandma Rosa had always felt like its own reward rather than an investment requiring return. Now I understood that she had been aware of these dynamics all along, that she had recognized the transactional nature of most family members' relationships with her, and had felt both disappointed and unsurprised by it. She had spent her final months arranging circumstances that would reveal everyone's true priorities at the moment when inheritance was distributed. And she had ensured that the person who had shown up consistently without ulterior motivation would ultimately receive the asset everyone else had coveted. A poetic justice that validated years of genuine relationship, while exposing years of calculated performance. The pattern of my family's dismissiveness toward my career and life choices had not emerged suddenly at the will reading. Rather, it represented the culmination of years of accumulated slights, dismissals, and subtle cruelties that had calcified into an accepted family narrative about who I was and what my choices meant. Understanding this history was essential to appreciating why Grandma Rosa's gift represented not just financial vindication, but emotional validation of a decade spent defending my worth against people who should have celebrated it. The earliest instance I could clearly remember occurred during my college graduation ceremony. I had earned my degree in elementary education with honors, had already secured a position at an inner-city school known for its challenging student population and innovative teaching approaches, and had felt genuinely excited about beginning my career. My parents had attended the ceremony along with Vanessa, who was finishing her second year of law school at a prestigious program 3 states away. After the ceremony concluded, we had gathered for a celebratory dinner at an upscale restaurant my father had selected. The evening had begun pleasantly enough with toasts and congratulations that felt sincere if somewhat subdued compared to the elaborate celebration Vanessa had received 2 years earlier when she completed her undergraduate degree in political science. The tone had shifted when my father asked about my job offer, and I had enthusiastically described the school where I would be teaching. I explained that Roosevelt Elementary served predominantly low-income families, many of them recent immigrants or first-generation Americans, and that the school had received grants to implement creative arts integration across the curriculum. I would be teaching 3rd grade with flexibility to develop interdisciplinary units that connected literacy with visual arts, music, and movement. The position paid $38,000 annually, which seemed adequate to me given my modest lifestyle and the loan repayment assistance available for teachers who committed to working in underserved schools. My mother had set down her wine glass with more force than necessary and asked whether I had considered the financial implications of that salary. Before I could respond, she had begun calculating aloud what my monthly take-home pay would be after taxes and loan payments, comparing it unfavorably to what Vanessa could expect to earn once she finished law school and joined a firm. My father had attempted to redirect the conversation by suggesting that teaching was noble work and that passion mattered more than salary, but even his supportive statement had contained the implicit suggestion that I was sacrificing financial security for idealism, as though the two could never coexist. Vanessa had been less diplomatic in her assessment. She had leaned back in her chair with an expression that blended concern with condescension, and asked whether I had really thought through what it would mean to live on that salary in an expensive metropolitan area. She had pointed out that I would struggle to afford my own apartment without roommates, that I would need to be extremely careful with spending, and that I would have essentially no disposable income for travel or entertainment or building savings. She had framed these observations as practical realities I needed to face rather than as judgments about my choices, but the underlying message had been unmistakable. I was choosing poverty and struggle when I could have selected a path that provided comfort and security. I had tried to explain that I had already created a budget that accounted for my expenses, that I was comfortable with a modest lifestyle if it meant doing work I found meaningful, and that financial wealth was not my primary measure of success or happiness. My mother had responded by saying that it was easy to romanticize poverty when you had never actually experienced it, and that I would change my tune after a few years of struggling to make rent and watching my friends from college advance in more lucrative careers. The comment had stung particularly because it dismissed my choice as naive romanticism, rather than acknowledging it as a conscious decision based on clearly articulated values. The dinner had concluded awkwardly, with my graduation celebration overshadowed by my family's disappointment and concern about the path I had chosen. Grandma Rosa had not been able to attend the graduation ceremony due to a conflict with a scheduled medical procedure, but she had invited me to dinner the following week at her favorite restaurant. During that meal, she had asked me to describe my new position in detail, had listened with genuine interest as I explained the curriculum approach and student population, and had told me that she admired my courage in choosing a path that served others rather than enriched myself. She had presented me with a gift that evening, a leather messenger bag for carrying teaching materials, and had included a card that said she was proud of the woman I had become and confident that I would make a profound difference in children's lives. The contrast between that affirmation and my family's disappointment had been stark, and it had established a pattern that would persist throughout the following decade. Every professional milestone or achievement in my teaching career would be met with muted acknowledgement from my family, while Vanessa's and Marco's accomplishments in law and finance were celebrated with enthusiasm and pride. When I received tenure in my teaching position after 3 years of exemplary evaluations, my mother had responded by asking whether tenure really mattered since teaching jobs were supposedly easy to find and I could presumably work anywhere. When Vanessa had been promoted to senior associate at her firm around the same time, my parents had hosted a dinner party to celebrate and had invited extended family and professional contacts to acknowledge her achievement. The disparity in recognition had extended to financial support as well. When Vanessa had purchased her first home at age 27, a sleek downtown condominium in a newly developed luxury building, my parents had contributed $20,000 toward her down payment as what they called an investment in her future. When Marco had wanted to purchase a more expensive car to project success to his banking clients, my father had co-signed his loan to help him secure better financing terms. Meanwhile, when I had asked my parents if they might contribute even a small amount toward the cost of classroom supplies I was purchasing with my own money because my school's budget had been cut, my mother had suggested that if I needed extra income one should consider tutoring privately on weekends rather than expecting handouts. The word handouts had landed like a physical blow. My siblings had received substantial financial assistance for purchases that enhanced their lifestyles or career advancement, but my request for help serving my students had been characterized as asking for charity. The message had been explicit. My family would invest in endeavors they considered worthwhile, and my teaching career did not qualify. I had not asked them for financial help again after that conversation, instead taking on additional tutoring work and spending my own limited resources on materials and experiences for my students that I believed were essential, but that the school system could not or would not provide. The pattern had continued through various life events that highlighted my family's priorities and my divergence from them. When I had been selected to present at a national education conference about innovative literacy instruction methods I had developed, my family's response had been perfunctory congratulations followed quickly by redirection to discussing Vanessa's involvement in a high-profile legal case that had generated media coverage. When I had been featured in a local news segment about teachers making a difference in underserved communities, my mother had watched the segment and commented that it was nice, but had I considered that the publicity might hurt my chances of ever transitioning into a more serious career, since I was now publicly identified as an elementary school teacher. The implication that being publicly identified with teaching was somehow damaging to my professional prospects had revealed how fundamentally my mother misunderstood or dismissed the value of my work. She genuinely believed that teaching was something I was doing temporarily until I came to my senses and pursued a real career, and any public association with education was therefore a liability to be managed rather than an achievement to be celebrated. No amount of explanation or evidence of my commitment and satisfaction seemed capable of penetrating her conviction that I had made a mistake I would eventually need to correct. Marco had contributed his own form of dismissiveness through his habit of offering unsolicited financial advice that consistently positioned my teaching career as the root cause of problems that could only be solved by career change. When I had mentioned struggling to save for retirement on my salary, he had immediately launched into a lecture about the importance of maximizing earning potential during peak career years, and suggested that I was sabotaging my financial future by remaining in a low-paying field. When I had explained that teachers had pension benefits that provided retirement security even if the salaries were modest, he had dismissed public pensions as unreliable and insufficient compared to the aggressive investment strategies he employed with his substantial income. He had actually calculated for me once, using a napkin at a family dinner, what my lifetime earnings would be as a teacher compared to what I might earn if I transitioned into educational consulting or corporate training, fields that he assured me would value my experience while compensating me appropriately. The calculation had been meant to shock me into recognizing the opportunity cost of my choices, the millions of dollars I was supposedly leaving on the table by remaining in classroom teaching. When I had pointed out that his calculation ignored non-financial factors like job satisfaction, work-life balance, and sense of purpose, he had laughed and said that those were luxuries people could afford to consider only after they had secured financial stability, suggesting that prioritizing meaning over money was something only financially secure people could justify. The irony of a wealthy person telling someone with modest means that financial security must precede consideration of meaning had been lost on him entirely. He could not see that his own substantial income allowed him the privilege of dismissing meaning as secondary, while I had made the arguably more difficult choice to prioritize purpose despite financial constraints. His worldview positioned money as the foundation upon which everything else was built, while mine positioned purpose as the foundation that made financial challenges bearable and even worthwhile. Vanessa had developed her own particularly painful form of undermining that involved public comparisons designed to highlight the gap between our circumstances while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. At family gatherings, she would often steer conversations toward topics that emphasized disparity, asking me in front of extended family whether I had taken any interesting vacations recently when she knew my budget allowed only modest local trips, or commenting on her own expensive purchases while asking if I had treated myself to anything nice lately when she was aware I was living paycheck to paycheck. These questions were always framed as friendly interest, but the subtext was always comparison and the implied judgment that I was living a diminished life because of my career choices. One particularly excruciating example had occurred at a family holiday gathering 2 years earlier. Vanessa had arrived wearing an obviously expensive designer coat, and had made a point of mentioning casually that it had been a gift to herself for winning a significant case. She had then turned to me and asked what I had gifted myself lately for my accomplishments, as though the question were innocent curiosity rather than a calculated reminder that my accomplishments were not the kind that generated bonuses or that I could afford to celebrate with expensive purchases. When I had responded that I had treated myself to a nice dinner after receiving positive feedback from a student's parent, she had smiled with what looked like pity and said that it was sweet that small pleasures brought me such satisfaction. The phrase small pleasures had felt deliberately chosen to diminish both my achievements and my capacity for joy. The implication was that I had been forced by circumstance to find satisfaction in modest experiences because I could not afford the substantial pleasures available to more successful people. What Vanessa could not or would not understand was that my satisfaction came not from making peace with limitation but from alignment between my values and my daily life. The dinner I had celebrated had marked a breakthrough with a struggling student, whose parent had written to thank me for the patience and creativity I had shown in helping her child discover confidence and capability. That outcome mattered more to me than any case Vanessa might win, not because I could not appreciate the importance of legal work but because my measure of success was impact on individual human lives rather than professional prestige or financial reward. My cousin Adrian had contributed to the pattern through his habit of positioning his entrepreneurial success as evidence of what was possible for people who were willing to take risks and think strategically, with the clear implication that my career stability in teaching reflected risk aversion and limited thinking. At the family dinner celebrating his startup acquisition, he had given an impromptu speech about the importance of betting on yourself, and not settling for safe conventional paths that guaranteed mediocrity. He had never explicitly mentioned me in this speech, but several family members had glanced in my direction during his remarks, clearly drawing the intended parallel between his celebration of risk-taking and my choice of a stable teaching position. After that dinner, Adrian had approached me privately and offered what he framed as mentorship, suggesting that it was not too late for me to pivot into educational technology or curriculum development for corporate training programs, fields where my teaching background would be valued, but where the compensation and advancement potential were substantially greater. He had even offered to introduce me to contacts in those industries, positioning himself as generous with his network and concerned about my limited prospects. When I had declined by explaining that I loved classroom teaching and had no interest in leaving it, he had looked genuinely puzzled and asked why I would choose to limit myself when opportunities existed to leverage my experience into something more significant. The phrase "leverage my experience" had revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how I viewed my work. He saw teaching as a credential to be leveraged for career advancement into more prestigious or lucrative fields, while I saw it as a calling to be deepened and refined through continued practice and commitment. The possibility that teaching itself was the destination rather than a waypoint on a journey toward something better seemed incomprehensible to him. His worldview positioned career decisions as optimization problems where the goal was always to maximize status and income, and any choice that did not serve those objectives was by definition suboptimal and somewhat irrational. My Aunt Carolina had developed a particularly insidious form of undermining through excessive sympathy and offers of assistance that positioned me as someone to be pitied rather than respected. She would frequently give me clothing or household items that she was discarding, always framing these gifts as thinking of me because she knew teachers had to be careful with money. She would invite me to family events with the caveat that she understood if I could not afford to contribute to group gifts or shared expenses, always offering to cover my portion in ways that highlighted my financial limitations while allowing her to feel generous. She would ask intrusive questions about my budget and expenses under the guise of concern, wanting to make sure I was managing okay and offering suggestions for economizing that suggested she believed I was perpetually on the edge of financial crisis. The most painful aspect of her behavior was that it seemed to come from genuine concern rather than malice, which made it harder to address directly. How could I object to someone offering help or expressing worry about my well-being? Yet the cumulative effect of her constant attention to my financial situation was to reinforce a narrative that I was struggling and vulnerable, someone who needed rescue or at minimum needed to be monitored to ensure I was surviving my poor career choice. She could not seem to grasp that I was not in crisis but rather had made intentional choices that resulted in a modest but sufficient lifestyle, and that her excessive concern was more demeaning than supportive. Uncle Thomas had been more directly critical, periodically lecturing me about the importance of building wealth and securing financial independence, concepts he seemed to believe I could not understand because I had chosen teaching. He had told me more than once that youth was a time to maximize earnings and build a foundation for future security, and that by choosing a low-paying career in my 20s and 30s, I was virtually guaranteeing financial stress in my 40s and 50s when my options for career change would be limited. He had painted a picture of my future that included struggling to afford health care, being unable to help my own children with college expenses if I ever had any, and facing a retirement of austerity and dependence on others. These predictions had been delivered in a tone of regretful certainty, as though my financial future were already determined by choices I had made, and could not be altered no matter what I did. What Uncle Thomas had not considered was that his dire predictions assumed I shared his definition of success and security, that I would eventually regret not having accumulated more wealth or achieved higher status. The possibility that I might reach my 50s and 60s feeling satisfied with a life spent teaching, fulfilled by relationships with former students and contributions to my community, seemed not to exist within his framework for evaluating a life well lived. The pattern had extended to how the family discussed my personal life and romantic relationships. When I had been single after ending my engagement to Michael, family members had consistently framed my situation as problematic, something that needed to be solved rather than a neutral life circumstance, or even a positive opportunity for independence and self-discovery. My mother had repeatedly expressed concern that I was being too selective, that I needed to be more realistic about what kind of partner I could attract given my career and financial situation, and that I was at risk of ending up alone if I did not lower my standards and compromise on secondary issues like whether a potential partner respected my profession. The suggestion that respect for my career was a secondary issue, rather than a fundamental compatibility factor, had revealed how little my mother understood about what mattered to me in a partnership. She genuinely believed that financial security provided by a high-earning spouse should compensate for lack of respect or support for my professional identity, that I should be willing to trade validation for comfort. This perspective had made it impossible to discuss my romantic life with her honestly, because we were operating from completely different assumptions about what made a relationship successful or worth pursuing. Marco had offered to set me up with colleagues from his firm on multiple occasions, always describing these potential matches primarily in terms of their salaries, job titles, and material possessions rather than their character, values, or compatibility with me. When I had declined these offers, he had accused me of being unrealistic about my options and holding out for some fantasy of a relationship that honored both partners equally when in reality relationships required someone to be the primary earner and someone to be the support person, and given my career limitations I should accept that I would need to be the latter. The suggestion that my teaching career positioned me as naturally subordinate in any romantic partnership, that my modest income meant I should expect to play a supporting role to a higher-earning partner, had been both offensive and revealing of how Marco conceptualized relationships as fundamentally unequal arrangements based on relative earning power. Vanessa had been characteristically direct in her assessment of my romantic prospects, telling me after my engagement ended that I needed to decide whether I cared more about my pride or my future, whether I was willing to make reasonable compromises to secure a stable partnership, or whether I preferred to cling to some idealistic notion of equality that would leave me alone and struggling. She had positioned my desire for a partner who respected my career as stubborn pride rather than reasonable standards, and my preference for authentic partnership over financially advantageous arrangement as naive idealism rather than clear-eyed understanding of what I needed to be happy. These conversations about my personal life had been among the most painful aspects of family dynamics because they suggested that my relatives believed I was unworthy of the kind of partnership I desired, that my career choice had diminished my value in ways that required me to accept whatever I could get rather than holding out for what I actually wanted. The message underneath all their advice and concern was that I had made myself less desirable through my choices, and that I needed to adjust my expectations downward accordingly. Grandma Rosa had witnessed much of this pattern over the years, had listened to family discussions that diminished my choices and questioned my judgment, and had consistently offered a counter-narrative that validated my path. When family members had expressed concern about my financial situation, she had pointed out that I was meeting my obligations and living within my means, that modest income was not the same as poverty or crisis. When they had worried about my romantic prospects, she had reminded them that meaningful partnership based on mutual respect was worth waiting for, and that settling for less would be a far worse outcome than remaining single. When they had questioned my career satisfaction, she had noted that I seemed genuinely happy and fulfilled in ways that had nothing to do with salary or status. But I had not fully understood until reading her letter that she had been doing more than offering emotional support in the moment. She had been conducting a long-term evaluation of the family's values and behavior, documenting through her observations over many years who demonstrated genuine love and respect versus who performed family connection, while actually measuring everything in transactional terms. She had been noting who celebrated achievements that mattered to me versus who could only recognize accomplishments that aligned with their own value system. And she had been planning a response that would expose these patterns at the moment when the family's true priorities would be most visible, the distribution of her estate and the revelation of who received what. Now, sitting in my car with her letter and the deed to Clearwater Lake, I understood that every dismissive comment, every sympathetic observation about my limited prospects, every comparison that positioned me as less successful than my siblings had been observed and noted by someone who saw through the surface judgments to the values they revealed. Grandma Rosa had recognized that my family's treatment of me reflected not my failures but their inability to measure worth in any terms beyond money and status. And she had crafted a response that would vindicate my choices at precisely the moment when my family's mockery would be most cruel, creating a reversal that was both personally satisfying and pedagogically powerful. The morning of the will reading had begun with an unusual sense of anticipation that I had tried to suppress, but could not entirely dismiss. I had woken early in my small one-bedroom apartment, The space that my family considered evidence of my limited success but that I had carefully arranged to feel like home. The walls displayed artwork created by my students over the years, colorful paintings and drawings that represented breakthroughs and achievements far more meaningful to me than any expensive decor could have been. My bookshelves overflowed with teaching resources, children's literature, and the novels I read for pleasure when exhaustion from the school day finally subsided enough to allow concentration on someone else's story. I had stood in front of my modest closet trying to select appropriate clothing for the occasion, something respectful and professional that would not invite commentary from my family about my appearance or financial situation. I had finally settled on a simple black dress I had purchased several years earlier for a friend's wedding, paired with a cardigan that masked how the dress fit slightly differently now than it had when I bought it. The outfit was appropriate and unremarkable, which felt like the safest approach for an event where I expected to be peripheral to the main action of inheritance distribution among family members my grandmother had presumably favored with substantial bequests. The drive to the law office had taken me through neighborhoods that marked the economic geography of the metropolitan area, from my modest apartment complex through increasingly affluent areas until I reached the downtown district where Morrison and Associates occupied several floors of a glass tower that projected exactly the kind of success and prestige my family valued. I had parked in the visitor garage and sat for several minutes gathering my composure, preparing myself emotionally for what I anticipated would be an uncomfortable experience of watching my siblings receive substantial inheritances while I received token acknowledgement or perhaps nothing at all. I had arrived at the law firm's reception area 15 minutes early, partly from habit as a teacher who needed to be punctual and partly from a desire to settle myself before other family members arrived, and the dynamics I found exhausting began playing out. The reception area had been elegantly appointed with leather furniture, abstract art that probably cost more than my annual salary, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city. I had sat in one of the chairs positioned away from the main seating area, pulling out my phone to review messages from parents of my students, and using the familiar concerns and questions about their children's progress as an anchor to remind myself of what actually mattered regardless of what happened in the conference room. My mother and father had arrived next, my mother dressed in what was clearly a new outfit selected specifically for this occasion, something expensive and carefully coordinated that projected both mourning and sophistication. She had greeted me with a brief hug that felt performative rather than affectionate, immediately commenting that I looked tired and asking whether I had been getting enough sleep. The question had felt less like maternal concern and more like an opening observation in what would likely become a broader assessment of how my lifestyle and career were affecting my health and appearance. My father had been warmer in his greeting, squeezing my shoulder and asking how I was holding up after losing Grandma Rosa, a question that seemed to acknowledge actual grief rather than simply performing appropriate sentiment. Vanessa had arrived with her husband Derek, a corporate attorney she had married 3 years earlier in an elaborate wedding that had cost more than I would earn in 2 years of teaching. Vanessa had been dressed in a designer suit that managed to look both mourning appropriate and professionally impressive, her hair and makeup perfect in ways that suggested significant time and expense investment. She had air-kissed near my cheek in greeting and immediately launched into conversation with our mother about a recent case and the partner track timeline at her firm, effectively excluding me from their exchange through the technical legal language and insider references that I could not follow and was not expected to understand. Marco had arrived 15 minutes late, rushing in with apologies about a client call that had run longer than expected, his expensive suit slightly rumpled in ways that somehow made him look more important rather than less put together. He had acknowledged me with a brief nod before immediately checking his phone and responding to what appeared to be urgent work messages, performing the role of someone so essential and in demand that even a family obligation could not fully claim his attention. His wife Jessica, who worked in marketing for a luxury brand, had smiled at me sympathetically as though we were both peripheral to the serious business being conducted by the high-achieving siblings. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Carolina had arrived with their children Adrian and Sophia, the entire family dressed in coordinated dark colors that suggested they had discussed their appearance in advance. Adrian had been talking on his phone when he entered, his voice carrying across the reception area as he discussed some technical aspect of a business deal in language designed to impress anyone who might overhear. Sophia had been absorbed in her own phone, photographing the law office reception area in ways that suggested she planned to document the day on social media. curating even this family obligation into content that projected a certain lifestyle and status. Various cousins and extended family members had filtered in over the following minutes, most of them people I saw only at major family events and who knew me primarily through the family narrative as the teacher sister, the one who had chosen differently and whose choices were understood to have resulted in a lesser life. Several had greeted me with the kind of exaggerated warmth that people employ when they pity you, asking how I was doing with emphasis that suggested they expected teaching to be wearing me down, or that my modest circumstances must be creating stress and difficulty. I had responded with practiced pleasantness, deflecting their probing questions and redirecting conversation to neutral topics that did not invite assessment of my life choices. Robert Morrison had emerged from the conference room to greet the assembled family, his elderly demeanor projecting both professional competence and genuine sorrow at the loss of a longtime client he had clearly respected. He had shaken hands with various family members, accepting condolences about losing Grandma Rosa as though he too were grieving rather than simply performing a professional service. When he had reached me, he had held my hand between both of his for a moment longer than he had with others and said quietly that Rosa had spoken of me often during their final meetings together, that she had been very clear about her wishes and very confident in the choices she was making. At the time, I had interpreted this as simple kindness, an elderly attorney trying to make the least favored grandchild feel slightly less invisible at a family gathering. The conference room had been large and formal, dominated by a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that could have accommodated 20 people comfortably. Windows along one wall offered views of the city skyline, the kind of vista that reminded you of status and success, and the importance of the business being conducted in spaces like this. My mother had immediately moved to position herself at a prominent seat near the head of the table, arranging Vanessa and Marco on either side of her like a demonstration of her successful children, the ones who had fulfilled her ambitions and validated her parenting. My father had sat beside her, and Uncle Thomas had claimed the opposite side of the table with his own family arranged around him in similar formation. I had taken a seat near the corner of the table, positioned where I could observe everyone without being central to the action, a spatial arrangement that reflected my role in family dynamics more generally. Several cousins had filled the remaining seats, and the room had gradually settled into expectant silence as Robert Morrison had arranged his materials at the head of the table and prepared to begin the formal reading. The atmosphere had been thick with anticipation barely disguised as solemnity, everyone present presumably calculating what they might receive, and how the distribution of Grandma Rosa's substantial estate might affect their own financial situations. Morrison had begun with a brief preamble about Rosa Delgado's life and character, acknowledging her as a remarkable woman who had built significant wealth through integrity and hard work, while maintaining commitments to community and family. He had noted that she had been very intentional in her estate planning, that she had revised her will multiple times in recent months, and that every decision reflected careful thought about what she hoped to accomplish through the distribution of her assets. This introduction had created a slight tension in the room, family members shifting in their seats and exchanging glances that suggested concern about what these careful revisions might mean for their own anticipated inheritances. The reading had proceeded through preliminary matters and small bequests to charitable organizations and longtime employees, distributions that generated polite attention, but no real engagement since they did not affect family inheritance. Then Morrison had moved into the distribution of personal property and real estate assets, reading each bequest in Rosa's own words as written in the will document. Vanessa had received the jewelry collection first, pieces that included Rosa's engagement ring and several items of both sentimental and monetary significance. Vanessa had actually clapped her hands together briefly before catching herself and assuming a more appropriately grateful expression, though her satisfaction had been obvious to everyone present. Marco had received the rental property portfolio next, for apartment buildings in appreciating neighborhoods that would generate substantial ongoing income, while also increasing in value over time. He had fist-pumped under the table in a gesture I had caught only because of my angle of view. His pleasure at receiving such valuable assets barely contained beneath a veneer of solemn gratitude. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Carolina had received commercial properties and financial assets respectively, distributions that clearly pleased them and affirmed their status within the family hierarchy. Adrian and Sophia had each received six-figure cash bequests that would fund business ventures or investment opportunities or lifestyle enhancements according to their individual priorities. Various other relatives had received smaller, but still substantial amounts, cash distributions or personal items or investment accounts that Rosa had established years earlier. Each announcement had been met with expressions of gratitude and satisfaction, some people clearly pleased with what they received and others perhaps disappointed that their inheritance was not larger, but still recognizing that they had received valuable assets. My mother had grown visibly tense as the reading continued without my name being mentioned, her jaw tight in ways that suggested she was bracing herself for the embarrassment of her daughter receiving nothing or receiving something so minimal it would humiliate the entire family. Then Morrison had looked directly at me, his gaze holding mine for a moment before he read from the will document. The words he spoke had included my full name with particular emphasis, as though he wanted to ensure everyone in the room was paying attention to this specific bequest. He had explained that Rosa Delgado left to her granddaughter Elena Maria Vasquez her most treasured possession, given with confidence that Elena would understand its true value and honor the principles it represented. Morrison had then bent down and retrieved from beneath the table a wooden box I recognized immediately, a beautiful mahogany container I had seen in Grandma Rosa's home office, sitting on the shelf behind her desk where she kept important documents and meaningful personal items. The box was approximately 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and perhaps 6 inches deep, constructed from dark wood that had been finished to a smooth polish. The craftsmanship was evident in the clean lines and the way the corners joined seamlessly, the kind of quality that suggested the box itself had value independent of whatever it contained. Morrison had placed the box on the table directly in front of me, his expression neutral but with something in his eyes that might have been anticipation or perhaps satisfaction, though at the time I had been too shocked and confused to analyze his demeanor carefully. For approximately 3 seconds, the room had been completely silent as family members processed what they had just witnessed. I had received a wooden box while others had received jewelry and properties and substantial cash. The disparity had been so extreme that initially no one had seemed to know how to respond, whether this was meant to be meaningful or whether it represented the ultimate dismissal, giving the disappointing granddaughter a container for memories while giving everyone else tangible assets of obvious value. Then someone had snorted with laughter, a sound that shattered the silence and opened the floodgates for the mockery that followed. Vanessa had covered her mouth but her eyes had been bright with amusement she could not fully contain. Marco had made a sound halfway between a laugh and a gasp of disbelief. My mother's face had flushed deep red with what I recognized as humiliation on my behalf or perhaps fury that her daughter had been given what appeared to be essentially nothing while her successful children received substantial inheritances. Various cousins had exchanged looks that ranged from pity to schadenfreude, some of them struggling not to smile at what they perceived as confirmation that even Grandma Rosa had recognized my limited worth. Vanessa had been the first to actually speak, her voice carrying across the conference room with false sweetness that made the cruelty more obvious rather than less. She had looked at me with exaggerated sympathy and commented on how sweet it was that Grandma had given me a memory box, something sentimental since we had spent so much time together. The emphasis she had placed on sentimental versus the tangible assets everyone else received had been unmistakable, her tone suggesting that memories were what you gave to people who did not really need or deserve money. She had continued speaking before I could formulate any response, turning to address the room as though interpreting the situation for everyone present and explaining that Grandma must have wanted me to have something personal since I had visited so frequently, things that mattered more when you did not really need the money. That final phrase had landed like a weapon, the suggestion that my modest income made me the perfect recipient for worthless sentimental items, while people with real careers and financial responsibilities deserved actual assets. The implication had been that my financial situation was so hopeless that even a substantial inheritance would not significantly improve it, so why waste valuable property on someone who would always struggle regardless? Marco had laughed outright at that point, not even attempting to disguise his amusement as he gestured toward the box and commented to Vanessa that at least someone got what they deserved, the perfect gift for someone satisfied with so little. The comment had struck me with physical force, the casual cruelty of suggesting that I deserved nothing of value, that my life choices had earned me exactly this outcome of receiving a box while watching my siblings inherit property and wealth. I had felt my face burning with humiliation and my eyes beginning to sting with tears I absolutely refused to shed in front of these people, who would interpret my emotion as confirmation that I recognized my own inadequacy. My hands had gripped the edge of the table as I fought to maintain composure, reminding myself that their judgments reflected their values rather than my worth, though in that moment their mockery had felt like objective assessment rather than subjective opinion. Uncle Thomas had attempted to redirect the conversation with a comment about all of us being grateful for what we received and honoring Rose's memory rather than making comparisons, but even his intervention had felt patronizing rather than supportive, as though he were encouraging children to be gracious about unequal birthday presents rather than acknowledging that something genuinely hurtful had occurred. Aunt Carolina had reached across the table to pat my hand in what she clearly intended as comfort while saying that sentimental value was priceless, and perhaps that was exactly what I needed rather than the burden of managing real estate or investments, the implication being that I was too incompetent to handle actual assets and Grandma Rosa had wisely given me something that could not lose value because it had none to begin with. Robert Morrison had maintained professional neutrality throughout these exchanges, but I had noticed something in his expression when our eyes met briefly, something that resembled anticipation or perhaps solidarity rather than the pity I saw in most other faces. He had cleared his throat and reminded everyone that Rose's instructions had been explicit, that each bequest had been made with considerable thought and specific purpose, and that perhaps judgment should be withheld until people fully understood what they had received. The statement had created a momentary pause in the mockery as family members processed his words, but Vanessa had recovered quickly and suggested with a smile that felt deliberately cruel that they all understood perfectly well what everyone had received. Some people had received futures while others had received the past. I had left the conference room in a state of shock and humiliation, clutching the wooden box against my chest like armor, as I navigated past family members who were already clustering in small groups to discuss the distribution of assets they had received. Their voices had followed me down the corridor toward the elevators, fragments of conversation about property values and investment strategies and tax implications, the practical matters that occupied people who had received tangible wealth, rather than what everyone assumed was a container of sentimental trinkets. No one had followed me or called after me to offer comfort or to question whether there might be more to my inheritance than appeared on the surface. Their disinterest had been as painful as their earlier mockery, the swift dismissal that allowed them to move on to more important matters while I processed what felt like public confirmation of my inadequacy. The elevator ride to the parking garage had felt interminable, though in reality it lasted perhaps 30 seconds. I had studied my reflection in the polished metal doors, seeing a woman who looked simultaneously younger and older than her 32 years, someone who had just endured something that felt like ritual humiliation, but who had managed not to cry in front of the people who would have interpreted tears as validation of their assessments. My hands had trembled slightly as I held the box, and I had forced myself to take slow, deliberate breaths to maintain the composure that felt essential to preserving whatever dignity remained after what had just occurred. Once inside my car with the door closed and the privacy of my own space restored, I had allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The tears came in waves, each one carrying a different layer of hurt. I cried for the embarrassment of receiving what everyone believed was nothing while my siblings received fortunes. I cried for years of dismissiveness and judgment that had culminated in this moment of apparent confirmation that even my grandmother had recognized my limited worth. I cried for the loss of Grandma Rosa herself, the one person who had consistently validated my choices, and whose absence left me more vulnerable to my family's cruelty than I had been when she was alive to serve as counterbalance to their judgments. But beneath the tears was also anger, a hot righteous fury at the casual cruelty my family had displayed. Vanessa's mocking sympathy, Marco's dismissive laughter, my mother's visible humiliation, the cousin's barely suppressed amusement, all of it represented years of accumulated judgment finally expressing itself without restraint because the person who had protected me was no longer present to witness their behavior. They had felt free to mock me openly because Grandma Rosa could not object, could not defend me, could not point out that their values were impoverished regardless of how much wealth they accumulated. The freedom they felt to be cruel revealed what they had thought all along but had previously kept slightly veiled out of respect for her or fear of her disapproval. After perhaps 10 minutes of crying, the storm of emotion had begun to subside into occasional hiccups and the hollow exhaustion that follows intense feeling. I had wiped my face with tissues from my glove compartment and looked down at the wooden box still resting in my lap. Whatever pain and humiliation I felt about how the family had responded to my inheritance, the box itself remained beautiful, clearly crafted with skill and care. The wood was smooth under my fingers, the brass clasp gleaming despite what must have been years or even decades of age. If nothing else, this box had belonged to someone I loved who had loved me, and there was value in that connection regardless of what anyone else thought. I had taken a deep breath and carefully opened the brass clasp, lifting the lid with no clear expectations but assuming Vanessa's guess about photographs or letters was probably accurate. What I found instead had made my breath catch and my hands begin shaking for entirely different reasons than they had shaken moments before. Resting on top of several legal documents was a letter in Grandma Rosa's handwriting, the distinctive slightly slanted script I would have recognized anywhere. The pale blue stationery was the kind she had always used for personal correspondence, and seeing those familiar loops and curves had brought fresh tears to my eyes even as my heart began racing with anticipation about what the letter might contain. But it was what lay beneath the letter that had truly shocked me into stillness. Legal documents with official seals and stamps, property deeds with descriptions and parcel numbers, keys attached to a leather fob, and what appeared to be architectural plans folded carefully to fit within the box. These were not sentimental photographs or nostalgic letters. These were legal instruments that conveyed ownership and control, documents that represented substantial value and significant assets. My hands had trembled as I lifted the letter to read it first, needing to understand what Grandma Rosa had done and why before examining the supporting materials that would give concrete form to whatever she was about to explain. The letter had begun with an endearment that immediately brought her voice into my mind, her slight accent and the warmth she infused into language even when discussing practical matters. She wrote that if I was reading this letter, she had passed on and the family had gathered for the will reading. She imagined that I had just endured mockery or dismissiveness from relatives who believed she had given me nothing of value, while blessing them with tangible assets. She wanted me to know that everything had unfolded exactly as she planned, and that what I held in my hands represented not an afterthought or consolation prize, but rather the culmination of her life's work, and the future she envisioned for someone who shared her deepest values. I had read that paragraph 3 times, my mind struggling to process what she was telling me. Everything had unfolded as she planned. She had anticipated the family's reaction. She had orchestrated this outcome deliberately, knowing how they would respond and presumably intending for me to discover the truth only after witnessing their cruelty. The realization that their mockery had been predicted and in some sense invited by Grandma Rosa's design created a dizzying sense of vindication mixed with continued confusion about what exactly she had given me, and why she had structured the revelation this way. The letter continued with information that made my heart pound so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. Grandma Rosa explained that the box contained the deed to the lakefront property on Clearwater Lake, the crown jewel of her real estate portfolio, and the one asset every family member had coveted for decades. I had stopped breathing as I read those words, then read them again to confirm I had understood correctly. Clearwater Lake. The property that represented everything my family valued about Grandma Rosa's success. The 5 acres of pristine waterfront with the beautiful main house and guest cottage, and boathouse and gardens that had been the setting for family gatherings throughout my childhood. The property appraised at over $2 million that Uncle Thomas wanted to convert into a wedding venue, that Vanessa wanted to sell to fund her partnership, that Marco wanted to develop into luxury condominiums. She had given it to me. The family member they had just mocked for receiving nothing now owned the single most valuable piece of her estate. The person they considered too simple and unworldly to handle real assets had inherited the property they all wanted most. The irony was so profound that I started laughing through my tears, a sound that probably seemed unhinged, but that felt like the only possible response to such a dramatic reversal of what everyone in that conference room had believed about the distribution of Grandma Rosa's wealth. But the letter did not stop with simply conveying ownership. Grandma Rosa explained her reasoning in terms that revealed she had been watching and evaluating family dynamics for years with more attention and insight than I had realized. She wrote that she had chosen me not despite my modest career and simple life but precisely because of those choices. Over the past 5 years, she explained, she had watched each family member reveal their true priorities through how they related to the Clearwater property. Uncle Thomas had stopped visiting once she made clear she would not discuss its future while alive, demonstrating his interest was in the asset rather than spending time with her. Vanessa had brought real estate agents to family gatherings to get informal valuations. Marco had repeatedly suggested she should sell and move somewhere more manageable, transparent code for wanting her to liquidate assets so he could inherit cash. Meanwhile, I had simply continued showing up whether we were at her primary residence or at the lake house. I had helped maintain the gardens without being asked, had repaired things when I noticed they needed attention, had brought my students to the property for celebrations because I knew she loved children's laughter filling the space. I had never asked about her plans or suggested she should change anything. I had valued the place for what it was rather than what it might become, and that distinction had meant everything to her. The letter explained that the property was not simply a gift, but also a responsibility and a test of character. She had established a trust fund covering property taxes and maintenance for 5 years, giving me time to determine how to steward the land without immediate financial pressure. But she had also included specific instructions about what she hoped I would do with the place. She wanted it to become a retreat center for teachers, a space where educators could spend weekends or summer weeks rejuvenating away from professional demands. She envisioned writing workshops and art classes, garden therapy and quiet contemplation, a place honoring the sacred work of teaching by providing restoration that society rarely offered to teachers. She had included architectural plans for converting the guest cottage into sleeping quarters, accommodating up to 12 teachers at a time. She had outlined renovation budgets drawn from a separate account established specifically for this purpose. She had even contacted educational nonprofit organizations that expressed interest in partnering to subsidize costs for teachers who could not afford retreat fees. Everything had been researched and planned with the meticulous attention she applied to every business venture throughout her life. The difference was that this venture measured success not in profit margins, but in lives touched and spirits restored. The letter concluded with words that pierced my heart and made me cry again. Though these tears felt different from the earlier ones born of humiliation and grief. Grandma Rosa wrote that she had spent 50 years building wealth, but measured her life's success by whether she had built anything that outlasted bank accounts and property deeds. She hoped I would take the place she loved and transform it into something serving others, that I would prove to our family that the most valuable inheritance was not cash or assets but commitment to making the world gentler and more supportive for those who dedicated their lives to helping others. She wrote that she was proud of me, had always been proud of me, and knew I would honor her memory by using this gift in ways that multiplied its value through compassion rather than calculation. I sat in my car reading and rereading that letter, my understanding of the previous hour shifting completely as I recognized what Grandma Rosa had orchestrated. She had let the family reveal their true characters through their assumptions and reactions to what appeared to be my receiving nothing. She had predicted their mockery because she had witnessed those attitudes expressed in subtler ways for years. And she had constructed a situation where their cruelty would be fully displayed at the precise moment when I discovered I had inherited what they all wanted most. The vindication felt secondary to the profound validation of knowing someone had truly seen me, had understood the challenges I faced within family dynamics, and had crafted a response affirming my choices while exposing the emptiness of theirs. But even as I processed the emotional impact of Grandma Rosa's letter and gift, practical questions began emerging. I needed to verify that the documents in the box were authentic and legally binding. I needed to understand the implications of suddenly owning property worth over $2 million while earning a teacher's salary. I needed to determine how to tell my family what I had actually received, and how they were likely to respond when they discovered the truth. And beneath all those practical concerns was a deeper question about whether I was truly capable of executing Grandma Rosa's vision, whether I had the knowledge and resources and emotional strength to transform the Clearwater property into the teacher retreat center she had imagined. I carefully examined the documents beneath the letter, pulling each one out and reading through language I only partially understood. The deed was official and appeared properly executed, transferring ownership of the property described as Parcel 847-3901 on Clearwater Lake from Rosa Maria Delgado to Elena Maria Vasquez. There were tax documents showing that property taxes for the current year had been paid, and that a trust account had been established with sufficient funds to cover 5 years of estimated taxes and basic maintenance. There were insurance documents showing the property was covered under a policy that would transfer to my name upon recording the deed. There were architectural plans showing the guest cottage renovation that Grandma Rosa had envisioned, detailed drawings with notes about materials and costs and timeline for completion. At the bottom of the box were keys, 3 sets attached to the leather fob I recognize from having seen it hanging in Grandma Rosa's home office. 1 key was labeled main house, another guest cottage, and the third boathouse. Holding those keys in my hand made the inheritance feel suddenly concrete and real in ways that even the legal documents had not quite accomplished. These keys would unlock doors to spaces I had visited dozens of times throughout my life, places filled with memories of family gatherings and quiet afternoons with Grandma Rosa. Except now those spaces belonged to me, and what happened to them would be determined by my decisions rather than inherited family patterns or default trajectories. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.